The science that we see in the present is consistent with what we would expect given that God created the way he says he did a few thousand years ago, as recorded in the book of Genesis. You might wonder why it is that there are people on both sides of this issue, intelligent people on both sides of this issue, some brilliant evolutionists who are good scientists, PhD scientists who believe in evolution, and then there are brilliant PhD scientists who believe in creation. And it's obviously not merely about evidence. It's about how we look at the evidence. We all have a way of thinking about things, which you can think of like mental glasses. And we creationists and evolutionists, we look at the same world through different lenses, and we draw very different conclusions about what the evidence means. So when a secularist looks at the world, he's already thinking in terms of millions of years of slow, gradual processes producing the things on earth, the philosophy of uniformitarianism, that rates and conditions are basically constant. He's thinking in terms of millions of years of struggling and so on, and extinction leading from one kind of organism to evolve into another. He's already got that in his mind when he looks at a fossil. And that affects the conclusions that he draws from that fossil. I start with the Bible because it's the history book of the universe. And it's not just any history book. It's a history book written by inspiration of God, meaning that what the Bible says is what God affirms. So, and it's written primarily by eyewitnesses, but ultimately by the ultimate eyewitness, God himself, the creator. And the Bible gives us the true history of the universe, which we sum up in the 7 C's. So that's just a way of remembering biblical history, starting with creation, where God made a world that he himself called very good. It wasn't full of death and suffering. That came later as a result of Adam's sin. That's corruption. Adam was given charge over the world. His sin affected everything under his authority. And so all the animals were affected. God cursed even the plants. Thorns and thistles came forth as a result of sin. Then we have the catastrophe, where the wickedness of mankind became great. And God is a righteous God. He won't let sin go unpunished forever. And so he judged the world with a cataclysm, the worldwide flood, responsible for a lot of the fossils that we see today, most of them. And then confusion. There was the confusion of tongues at Babel, where God split up the people groups by language, and that is responsible for the base language groups that we have today. Languages change over time a little bit more than that, but that's why we have so many base language groups. And it's responsible for the different ethnicities as well through genetic drift. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then Christ, God himself, steps into history as he promised to do. Back when Adam and Eve fell into sin, God promised that the descendant of Eve, the seed of the woman, would crush the head of the serpent. One of her descendants would destroy Satan's power, which Jesus did on the cross. And then the one seed that has yet to happen in its fullness is the consummation, where paradise lost will be paradise restored. And the world will again be very good as a result of Christ's obedience. And we can only enter that new earth if we've received Christ as Savior and our sins are covered and our nature's changed so that we don't ruin it as well. Now, that's the true history of the universe, written by one who was there. And so when I look at the world, I use that to inform me of what the evidence means. And so that's what I want to do this evening, is show you that when you look at the evidence through the lens of Scripture, it makes sense. And we're going to do that in 3 different fields of science. I'm going to spend the most time on genetics, which is the study of how traits are passed on from one generation to the next in human beings, in animals, in plants, in microbes for that matter. Then we'll look at information theory, which a lot of people haven't even heard of, but it powerfully confirms biblical creation. And then, time permitting, we'll look at geology. We'll look at things like rocks and the fossils that are found within many of these rock layers, and we'll see how they confirm creation and a worldwide flood. They really do. So we're going to start with genetics, the study of heredity, the study of how traits are passed on from one generation to the next, the study of how animals change over time. Do animals change over time? Do dogs change over time? They do. What do they change into? Dogs, yeah. Dogs change into dogs. And you can get all these different breeds from 2 dogs, and we'll see how that works. So Noah only had to have 2 dogs on Noah's Ark, and you can get all those breeds later. And we know how this works now because we understand genetics, at least the basics of it. But they remain dogs, always have been, always will be, because God made organisms according to their kind. That's a phrase that's repeated 10 times in Genesis 1, after its kind or according to its kind. We better take that seriously. The kind is the reproductive limit of an organism. It's important to note that kind does not mean species. That's a mistake that sometimes Christians who are first learning this issue inadvertently make, as they assume that those are the same thing. They're not. You can get multiple species from one kind. It's called speciation, and it happens. So a group of mosquitoes that's separated from the parent population, and 100 years later, when its descendants are brought back, they can't interbreed with the other population. They're classified as a new species, but they're still mosquitoes. Always have been mosquitoes, and unfortunately, they always will be, okay? So that's not evolution, that's just variation within a kind. It is speciation in some cases. See, I have to mention that because sometimes evolutionists misrepresent what it is that we creationists teach. You'll sometimes hear evolutionists say that creationists believe that God created all the species as we see them today, sometimes even in the locations they are in today. Well, that's not what the Bible teaches, and that's not what we teach. Okay, so this is a misrepresentation, the idea that animals have remained exactly the same as they were from creation. No, they remain the same kinds, but they do change a bit. What we actually believe is more like this: variation within a kind. And so, yes, you can get different breeds of dog. You can get different varieties of cats, for example. There was some debate years ago as to whether there's one cat kind or two or three. We now know there's one cat kind. All cats are related. And by that, I mean the big lion that you see at the zoo and that little pathetic thing you come home and pet. They're related. They're both descended from two cats that were on Noah's Ark that were probably intermediate to those. But in any case, there's one cat kind. There's one dog kind. As far as we know, there's one dog kind. And then there's other varieties and so on. There's an elephant kind, and some variations of that kind have gone extinct. Like we don't have mammoths anymore, but we do think they're part of the elephant kind. But we still have Asian elephants and African elephants. We still have modern varieties. That's okay. Some entire kinds have been wiped out. We don't have the dinosaurs around anymore. And so, but other kinds remain, and certain variations have happened over time. This is what we actually believe, but they do remain the same kind. That's always the case. And so, yes, you can get these new varieties, things like poodles, that were not around in the Garden of Eden, because it was very good when God first made the world, right? So you're not going to have poodles running around biting your leg and everything. No, those are one of the varieties that's sprouted out later due to the curse, as we'll see. In the evolutionary worldview, there's one kind, because everything's related in the evolutionary worldview, right? You're related to broccoli in that worldview. As I mentioned this morning, that's what evolutionists, that's what they believe. They believe that all the kinds are related. And so everything descended from a single-celled organism, something like a bacterium, over hundreds of millions of years. Now, to see which of these views is most consistent with science, we need to know about DNA. This is a very long molecule that occurs in the cells of your body. It looks like a twisted ladder. And on the rungs of this ladder are nucleotide base pairs. There's 4 different varieties of them, and you'll see them abbreviated by the 4 letters that you see there: C, G, A, and T. And the C's and G's line up. If C is on one strand, G will be on the complementary strand. And the A's and T's line up as well. But on a given strand, you don't know which letter is going to come next. C, G, A, T, T, G, A, D. You don't know which letter is going to come next. And depending on how those are arranged, it spells out the information to make the proteins that make up you, which is really amazing. Much the way you could spell help with beads on a rope in Morse code by the way they're arranged. The information in DNA, the way those base pairs are arranged, spells out the information to make proteins that make up you. It's astonishing. And proteins are what you're made of, and they're also think of them as little microscopic machines that work inside your cells. And some of them are structural, some of them do things. They're amazing. Proteins are amazing. And they're made up of amino acids, and 3 of these letters specify which amino acid goes next in the sequence. And there's also a start and a stop codon that tells it to start producing the next protein. And then there's mechanisms that cause the proteins to fold in the correct way so that they function properly. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. I mean, we think we're very clever when we can get all this information on a Blu-ray, and that is impressive. But God put the information to make you on a molecule. That's amazing. Amazing. You have 3 billion of these instructions, 3 billion base pairs times 2 sets of DNA, so 6 billion base pairs. That's amazing. I don't know if that's like a lot, or really, do I really reduce to 6 billion numbers? Well, of course, there's my experiences too, and there's my immaterial spirit, but my physical form, perhaps my personality, determined greatly by the arrangement of these base pairs. You have 2 different sets of DNA. You get 1 set from dad, you get 1 set from mom. They have 2 sets of DNA, which they got from their parents all the way back to Adam and Eve, who had 2 sets of DNA that they got from God. And when mom and dad have children, I should mention a section of DNA that determines a trait is called a gene. And so I've highlighted in different colors different genes, sections of DNA that control a trait. So there's genes for eye color, hair color, and things like that, how tall you're going to be and so on. And when mom and dad have kids, each kid gets one of the two sets of genes from each parent. And you don't know in advance which of the two it's going to be from each parent. And so they have a new combination. And the next child has another combination, and the next child, and so on and so forth. And so you look a little bit like your brothers and your sisters because you got your information from your parents, but you might notice that you have some traits that neither parent has. That's because you have a unique combination. You still got the information from your parents, but you have a combination that is potentially unique unless you have an identical twin. Here's the way it works with blood type. With blood type, there's two different genes that control what your blood type will be. If you have A and A, the A and A gene, your blood type is A. That's easy. If you have A and O, your blood type is A, because A is dominant, O is recessive. A dominant trait will cover up a recessive one. And likewise, if you have O and A, your blood type's A. So there's the different ways you could have the A blood type. And then if you have one of these combinations, your blood type is B. If you have an A from one parent and a B from the other parent, your blood type is AB. Those are codominant genes. They both express. The only way you can have blood type O is to get the O from dad and the O from mom, and then your blood type will be O. That's the universal donor, right? And what I find interesting is if mom has blood type A, and let's say it's what we call the heterozygous A, where it's an A and O combination, and dad has heterozygous B, the children could have any possible blood type because they could get the A gene from mom and the O from dad, and their blood type would be A, like mom. And then the next child could get the O from mom and the B from dad, and their blood type would be B. The next child could get the A from mom and the B from dad, and their blood type would be AB. The next child could get the O from mom and the O from dad, and their blood type is O. Isn't that neat? In one generation, you get any blood type. So it would make sense maybe Adam and Eve had that combination. That's one possibility. There's a couple others, but so you can, so first child says, I've got blood type A, I'm like mom. And the next one says, I'm B, I'm like dad. The next one, AB. The next one says, well, I'm blood type O, am I adopted? No, you still got the information from your parents. It's just you have a unique combination. Again, unless you have an identical twin, you have a unique combination. So that's why you have some traits that look like dad, some traits that look like mom, and some traits you're like, well, where did that come from? Well, it came from God, but it was still passed on through your parents. That's how it works. Here it is with skin shade. People talk about skin color. We really all have the same skin color, brown. It's just a question of how much. How much do you have? There's a pigment called melanin. There's actually a couple different forms of it. There's a gray form and a yellow form. We're just talking about the gray form here. But if you have a lot of that pigment, you tend to have very dark skin. If you have a little bit, you tend to have very light skin. Okay, and so if you have these genes, you're going to be born with very dark skin. If you have these kind of genes, you're born with very light skin. Now, your body has the ability to adjust a little bit. If you spend a lot of time in sunlight, it will increase the melanin because that protects you from ultraviolet radiation. But you don't pass it on because your genes stay the same. If you get really tan, your kids are not born tan, right? We understand that. Yeah, that's how it works. If you work out, your kids are not born muscular. That's just the way it works because it doesn't change your genes. It doesn't change your genes. But and by the way, if you're in this box here and you get married to somebody in that box, your kids will be in that box because that's the only possibility left. That's what we call a homozygous combination. You get locked in to that particular traits. And likewise up here or here, anywhere along this axis, if you get married to somebody in the same box, your kids will be in that box. But if you're off axis, if you're up here and you have a heterozygous combination, big A, big B, little b, and you get married to somebody in that box, your kids could have any skin shade from very dark to very light. And so we think Adam and Eve probably were a middle brown skin color, skin shade. And there's still places in the world where that happens, places in India where people have that combination, and at the same dinner table, one will be very dark, one will be very, very light, even though they're siblings. So that's not a problem. We're going to look at dogs because dogs have tremendous amounts of heterozygosity, big A, big B, little b, and so on. And you can get many different breeds of dogs. God has built tremendous variety into the dog kind. And so we'll take a look and see how that happens. Also, dogs reproduce fairly quickly, so we can see how this works over several generations because they tend to be shorter lived than humans. But if something like evolution's true, then bacteria, which have some information, some instructions in their genome, in their DNA, they have instructions to make bacteria, which is why that's all they can make. But if they evolved into horses, because horses have a lot more information in their DNA. Horses have information to make bones. Bacteria do not have those instructions. Horses have information to make eyeballs. Bacteria do not have those instructions. And so it seems to me that if bacteria gave rise to horses, then at some point they had to gain brand new information in their DNA. Is that pretty obvious, right? Because a horse has more information in its DNA. It's not just that it has more DNA, which it does, but it has instructions, information in its DNA that bacteria lack. And so if bacteria evolved into horses, if they gave rise to horses, at some point they must have gained brand new information. And that's important because all the processes that we observe in nature reduce genetic information. They don't increase it, which means they're actually in the opposite direction to cause evolution. Pretty much every process and somebody who's promoting evolution will say, take a look at this kind of change. Yeah, that's a change, all right, but it's in the opposite direction. It's not increasing the instructions, the information in the DNA. It's decreasing it. I'll give you one example of this, natural selection. A lot of people think that natural selection is the same as evolution, but really they're the exact opposite because they're in opposite directions. Remember, evolution, you have to gain brand new information in the DNA. With natural selection, you lose it. Let me show you how this works. Suppose you have two dogs, and suppose they have a gene for, each one has a gene for short fur and a gene for long fur, and suppose those genes have a combined effect, and so you have medium length fur. Now this is simplified, but the basic genetic principles here are true. And so if those dogs, male and female, and they fall in love and they get married, and I do this for kids sometimes, so. And they have pups. Now, some of the pups are going to get the short gene from mom and the short gene from dad, and they're going to have very short fur, just like their parents. Or pardon me, shorter than their parents. Some dogs are going to get the short gene from one parent and the long gene from the other, and they'll have medium-length fur, just like their parents. In fact, 50% of the offspring statistically would have that combination. 1/4 of them would get the long gene from mom, the long gene from dad, and they would have very long fur. So in one generation, you can have quite a bit of variety when the parents have heterozygosity. Two different genes. The offspring, you can get lots of variety in the offspring. Okay, now, is this evolution? Have we gained any new information? No, because we started with information for short and long, and by combination medium, and we ended up with dogs that had short, long, and by combination medium. There's no new information there. All the information in the offspring came from the parents. No new instructions. But suppose that the weather gets very cold, the environment gets very cold, what's going to happen? Well, the dogs that have the shorter and medium length fur, they don't do so well in a cold environment, right? Because they're not well insulated against the cold, and in the worst case scenario, well, they die. Very sad, okay? But the dogs that are well insulated against the cold, because they have the thick fur, they go on and reproduce, and they meet other dogs that have long fur, and what kind of dogs do they give rise to? Dogs with long fur. Yeah, exactly. And you see, that's the only dog they can produce, because the only gene that's left is the L gene. That's it. And so now there's one variety. Nature got cold, and the dogs responded by, it's not like they said, oh, hey, it's getting cold, I'm going to grow long fur. They already had long fur, and they survived because they already had traits suitable to that environment. Okay, it's not like they self-adjusted to the environment. Rather, they already had suitable traits. And the dogs with shorter and medium length fur didn't. And so they died. Or even if, best case scenario, maybe they were able to find shelter, but then because they have to spend all their time in shelter, they're not able to find each other. They don't reproduce in as great quantities as those that have the long fur. Okay, so it's an extreme case where they all are eliminated. But the ones that reproduce in greater numbers are the ones that are best suited to that environment. That's the definition of natural selection. That's what it means. Now, if we started the experiment over and we have all three varieties, and this time the environment gets very hot, what's going to happen? Well, now the dogs that have the longer and medium length fur, they don't do so well in that environment, so sadly they die, right? But the dog that has the shorter fur, he does very well in a warm environment, and so he's able to find other dogs that have survived because they too have short fur, and when they reproduce, they'll reproduce dogs with short fur. So natural selection refers to the reduction or even elimination of genes that produce traits that don't help you survive an environment. In fact, make it hard for you to survive in that environment. And so this is one type of adaptation. This is a generational adaptation where the environment got very warm, And the dogs that are able to survive and reproduce in that environment have short, thin fur. They do well. The dogs that had the thicker fur, they die from heat stroke. They don't do well in that environment. But is this evolution? Have we gained any new information? No. We started with information for long and short, and by combination medium, and we ended up with just information for short. Natural selection doesn't increase information, it reduces it. Natural selection is in the opposite direction of evolution. They're opposites. It's ironic. Darwin thought if he could convince people of natural selection, which is easy, he would persuade them of evolution. But see, he didn't really understand the genetic mechanisms. We do today. We know that natural selection is a downhill process. It reduces information. Evolution, allegedly, is an uphill process, requiring brand new information. You can't get new information by removing information. That should be obvious, right? And so this is how we account for the different breeds of wild dogs. Those that end up in the cold environment tend to have longer, thicker fur, because if they didn't, they would die. Those that end up in the hotter environments tend to have shorter, thinner fur, because if they didn't, they would die from heat stroke, and so on and so forth. And so you don't need two of each breed of dog on Noah's Ark. You just need two dogs. And they get off Noah's Ark, and they reproduce, and they spread, and they go away from the mountains of Ararat, and they disperse. And if the genes that they have produce traits that are good for that environment, then they survive in that environment. And if they don't, they tend to die off in that environment. And so lo and behold, dogs that end up in colder climates, sure enough, they have thicker fur genes and longer fur. And those that end up in the very hot environments tend to have very short fur, very thin fur. This is not evolution, it's natural selection. It's a great example of it. But could this ever turn a dog into a non-dog? Well, no. Because all the information's there in the parent generation, and you're just shuffling the information in the offspring. So this is how we account for the different varieties of wild dogs. It's just the information that God planted in the genome of the two dogs that were on Noah's Ark, at least, and then whether or not those traits are conducive to survival in that particular environment. And we find that dogs are well suited to their environment. That's why they have the traits that they have. Those traits were, the information for them was built in by God to the original dogs. And then if the dog's in the wrong environment, it tends to die off if it doesn't have the right traits. But no new information's been added. This is the opposite of evolution. That's one thing I want you to take away today, is that natural selection is the opposite of evolution. Very important point. But what about mutations then? Because my secular friends would say it's not just natural selection, Dr. Lisle, it's natural selection and mutations. What's a mutation? A mutation is a copying mistake, a mistake in your DNA. Now, dogs, for example, should have genes to produce 4 normal, healthy legs. And all dogs should have that information. It's not heterozygous, it's homozygous. They should all have the same genes for that. But during the process of reproduction, sometimes a mistake is made, a typo, as it were, and you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs. Sadly, he's missing some instructions, and so his legs don't form properly. And if you think about it, a dog like that, and we've seen little dogs like that, right? They're kind of cute, but they don't do so well in the wild because they got short, stubby little legs. They can't run very fast on those little legs. They certainly can't catch anything. They're more likely to be caught by something else. And so you won't find dogs like this in the wild. In fact, mutations in the wild tend to be reduced because they lead to problems. They can lead to disease. There's some mutations that are fatal. There's some mutations that cause your heart not to form properly. You're not going to pass that on because it's going to kill you, okay? And then there's some mutations like this that are just really inconvenient. They cause the dog not to be able to run very fast. But that little guy is not going to survive in the wild. He's just not, okay, because he's lost some information. He's lost some instructions. But some people like dogs with short, stubby little legs because they can't jump up on you as much. And so people will take these little things into their house and they will take care of them and feed them and bathe them and spend millions of dollars trying to keep them alive, right? And so these dogs don't have to survive in the wild because they have a human caretaker that will take care of all of their needs, right? So there you go. And so you will find that domestic breeds of dogs tend to be full of mutations because they don't have to survive in the wild. We take care of them. We sort of compensate for natural selection. They have a human caretaker. And so there are domestic breeds of dogs with all kinds of mutations because they're not weeded out by nature. We take care of them. We help them survive. That's a nice thing to do. But there are dogs that there's a mutation that causes the snout not to form properly. All dogs should have a long snout. That helps with their ability to smell. But there's a mutation that causes the snout to be short, but the jaw was designed to fit the longer snout, so they have a horrible underbite. And the skin that was designed to fit the longer snout, it kind of hangs off the side if you don't clean it and get infected. And some people think that's cute. You think the dog says, gee, I love having my nose stuffed into my face. That's great. Maybe not. Poodles have some problems, for example. Yeah. They're very cute, don't get me wrong, but they have some genetic problems. Well, and these are some of the diseases that can result either directly as a result of a mutation or as a secondary effect. For example, remember how we talked about the genes that regulate hair growth? You can have long or short. With a poodle, that gene is damaged, and they can't regulate their hair growth. Their hair grows forever. Yeah, which means if you have a poodle, every now and then you need to give it a haircut. Now, there's no way that animal could survive in the wild. There's no way. With all that hair, you end up with a big poof ball in no time at all. You will never see like a National Geographic special, out there in the Australian outback. Behold, the mighty poodle stalks his prey, right? You'll never see it. If you meet a poodle, it has a human caretaker to give it a haircut. Because if you don't, the hair can get into its eyes and they can go blind. Poodles tend to suffer from that, or it can get in their ears and cause infection. It can even kill them under certain circumstances. So if you see a poodle, it has a human caretaker. Now, this is what mutations do, folks. They don't give you superpowers like on Marvel. They turn you into poodles, okay? That's not what you want to be. So this is why we have the different varieties of domestic dogs. It's just a combination of the various information that God put in the dog kind, various different combinations along with mutations, mistakes that have crept in that caused little problems, caused disease in these creatures, okay? But it's not brand new information. It's a loss of information, and that's the point, okay? So mutations, like natural selection, remove information from your DNA. They scramble it. They get rid of some instructions, and that causes some problems in certain instances. And so we think the dogs that would have been on Noah's Ark would have been very much like the wolf kind, because wolves still have a lot of heterozygosity, big A, big B, little b, right? And then as you selectively inbreed those dogs, and that's how you get breeds, you select dogs that are similar, that are closely related, until you get down to the poodle, and that's kind of it. Because, that's the minimum amount of information to make a dog at that point, okay? You can't remove any more information, you're done. When I'm explaining this to kids, I say the information in your DNA is like jelly beans. And so you start out with the wild kinds of dogs like wolves and coyotes, lots of jelly beans, lots of information, mutations, and then by selectively breeding these animals and concentrating the mutations, you get rid of more and more information until you get down to the poodle, and then that's kind of it, right? Yeah. You can think of it a little bit like the different kinds of cars we have out there. There's some really nice cars out there, and some of the more expensive ones have a lot of extra stuff on them that you don't really need. Think of the Rolls Royce that has windshield wipers even on the headlights. That's neat, but you don't really need that, right? Whereas the poodle is more like a Kia. You remove one part from a Kia, it doesn't work anymore, right? Because it's the bare minimum of a car. And a poodle is the bare minimum of the dog variety, you see. Now, here's the point, though. Mutations are like removing information. They're removing jelly beans. Could you ever turn a dog into a cat by removing jelly beans? And the answer is no, because a cat has Jolly Ranchers. It's got different information, you see. And so mutations and natural selection, neither of them adds the new information you would need to make evolution work. Neither of them does that. They both remove genetic information. And so when we study dogs and we see how dogs reproduce, we find that dogs reproduce dogs. That's exactly what we'd expect given what the Bible teaches. Now, this is good observational science. It's testable, it's repeatable in the present, and it confirms biblical creation, that God created animals according to their kinds or after their kind, and they reproduce according to their kind because God brought two of each kind on board the ark to preserve life. So that seems to be the reproductive limit of an organism. It does not confirm evolution, where organisms are gaining brand new information. We do not see that in nature. We've never seen brand new information being added to the genome. And if evolution were true, that ought to be happening all the time. Now, I do have to point out that mutations can under certain circumstances, be beneficial. They can help an organism survive. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. But it's always by losing information, and therefore it's still in the opposite direction of evolution. Evolutionists like to talk about the occasional good mutation that helps an organism survive. That's true. But it's still in the opposite direction of evolution because it's reducing information. There's a mutation that causes an insect's wings not to form properly. And there are certain islands in the world where it's very windy, and we tend to find a lot of these mutations there because it actually helps the insect to survive. If the insect's flying, it tends to be blown off into the ocean and it dies. But if there's a mutation that causes its wings not to form, it can't fly. It's land-bound. And so it actually survives better in that environment because it's lost some information. There's antibiotic resistance in certain bacteria. Let me show you how this works. There's a bacterium called H. pylori, which causes stomach ulcers. And you don't like that, so you go to your doctor and he gives you an antibiotic. The antibiotic, your cells can't process that, but it interacts with an enzyme that the bacterium produces. It's part of his system. And when the antibiotic interacts with that enzyme, the enzyme converts the antibiotic into a poison, and then the poison kills the bacterium, and you feel better until you get your medical bill. There is a mutated form of H. pylori that lacks the ability to produce very much of that enzyme. He can only produce a little bit of it, almost none. And so when you take the antibiotic, it just sits there. He lacks the ability to convert it into a poison because he's missing some information. He's lost some information, and so the antibiotic, he lacks the ability to convert the antibiotic into a poison, and so he's resistant. And we find that these bugs are often, they tend to be more common in hospitals, especially in the past when hospitals would overuse antibiotics. It resulted in resistant strains. But that's not evolution. Evolution will say, see, that's evolution in action. No, it's not. It's a bacterium becoming a bacterium. It's not becoming a horse. And he hasn't gained any new instructions. He's lost some instructions. It's just that in that particular environment, it helped him survive. According to Dr. Lee Spetner, PhD biophysics at Johns Hopkins University, he says all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. And he's been studying this for like 50 years. Mutations remove information, they reduce it. They're in the opposite direction of evolution. He says not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. Isn't that interesting? And we're supposed to be made of these information-increasing mutations, but we don't see any of them. So again, this is good science. It's genetics. When we study genetics, we study mutations and observe how they work in the present. We find that they reduce genetic information consistent with creation, not consistent with the idea of evolution, where mutations and natural selection are supposed to gain new instructions to an organism and cause it to evolve into a higher organism. We don't see that. Well, we've been talking about information. There's actually an entire branch of science dealing with information and how it is transmitted and so on, called information theory, very popular in our computer age, and as it should be. And one of the things, well, first of all, it's good to define our terms. How would you define information? I mean, we kind of know what it is, right? You pick up a book, it's got information in it, but how would you define information? Well, Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, he wrote a book on this topic, and I'm going to kind of summarize his results. I'm going to condense it a little bit. But basically, he would define information as possessing these three criteria. Information always entails a symbolic code system. And so if I pick up a book and I see the word house, I don't see an actual house. I see a word that represents a house. That's a symbolic code system. Words represent what we call reference. Words are linguistic tokens, and they represent something perhaps in the physical world or even an idea like justice. Okay, so if a book has words, it has a symbolic code system. There's always a language convention. There are subjects and predicates, right? Nouns and verbs, things like that, things that you studied in elementary school, and they're in a particular order, and you have sentences and so on. And so, a book would have that. And meaning. I can read this and it means something. It's not just a bunch of random sentences strung together that mean nothing. You can learn something from it. There's an expected action on the part of the reader, and there's a purpose why the person wrote the book, right? There's a purpose in writing it. Let's take a cookbook, for example. Does a cookbook fulfill these criteria? It sure does. There's a symbolic code system. It says 3 teaspoons of sugar. That means something, right? And then language is that, take this ingredient and mix with that. It's in sentences. And then there's an action, an expected action on the part of the reader. The expected action is that the reader will take these ingredients and combine them in the way that this book says. And then the purpose is so that you won't go hungry. So a cookbook fulfills all those criteria. It has information in it. Okay? What about this? Could this be information? It looks like it could be. Is there a symbolic code system? Sure looks like it. Sure looks like it. You know, when hieroglyphics were first discovered, they suspected that they were information. It took them a while to figure out what they mean, and then the Rosetta Stone helped crack that. But they recognized that there was a symbolic code system there. Is there language? Well, it looks like it's organized into sentences, right? So it does look like there's a language there. Is there meaning? That's the tricky one. And for that one, you have to know how to decode the code. And fortunately, I know what the code is. So I can tell you that there is meaning here. And in fact, the meaning of this is Genesis 1 through 5. In the beginning, see like the clipboard, like in the beginning of a movie, right? Like action, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. It's Genesis 1 through 5. In the form of icons. That's pretty neat. So that is information. Yes, it is. Because it's got all the formula. It's got a code system, language, meaning. Now, whenever you find information, there are certain laws of nature that apply to it. Just like when you have energy, there are laws of nature that apply to energy. Like the first law of conservation of energy, which says energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. Right? So whenever you have energy, be assured that first law applies. First law of thermodynamics. Likewise, there are laws of information theory. And Dr. Werner Gitt has written a number of these laws in his book, In the Beginning Was Information, an excellent book. And one of the laws, one of the theorems that he writes in his book is that information never generates spontaneously in matter. He says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. What does that mean? Well, if you had a bowl of alphabet soup and you stir it up, you're not going to get Shakespeare, okay? You might get a word, but you won't get meaningful sentences with expected action and intended purpose, okay? You'd be lucky to get a word, and that would be kind of uncommon. You're not going to get brand new information. Information does not just spontaneously generate in matter. But where does it come from? It comes from a mind. And Dr. Werner Gitt points that out. He says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. He's talking about the fact that information can be copied, and the process of copying information does not necessarily require a mind. A Xerox machine can copy information, right? And it has no mind. But to produce information, it takes a mind. And so when you pick up a book and it's got information in it, you can bet that originated in a mind. Now, you can bet somebody wrote the book. It doesn't even occur to us to think otherwise, right? You pick up a book and you think, wow, I suppose this came about as a typewriter exploded. I mean, it wouldn't occur to you to think that way. You'd think somebody wrote it. Probably not that copy. That was probably made by a machine, a printing press that makes many books simultaneously. That's fine. But where did it get its information? From a computer, which got its information from another computer, and all the way back to a mind. Every time information, when you trace it backwards along that transmission path, it'll always go back to a mind. And that's really interesting because in DNA, what do we have? Information. The information to make you. Where did you get that information? You got it from your parents. It was copied by molecular machines, little enzymes that can copy DNA, right? During reproduction, it gets copied and you get half the information from each parent. But you got it from your parents, and they got it from their parents, and so on, all the way back to Adam and Eve, who got it from the mind of God. You see, the information in DNA is consistent with biblical creation, which says that information always originates in a mind. All the information to make all the different animals, plants, human beings, fungus, bacteria, whatever, came from the mind of God originally. Some of it's been lost over time due to natural selection and mutations. But those reduce information. And that's why we have little problems today, right? We have health problems. All of us do, because we have some mutations in us that have accumulated over the course of time. But we're We're not becoming superheroes. We're getting worse in terms of generationally. We're all going to eventually end up like the poodle, right? And of course, the Lord might come before that. He might have other plans. But you see my point. It's not consistent with evolution, though. Evolution says, no, all the information in your DNA came by chance, by mutations, weeded out by natural selection. But we haven't even seen one mutation that does that. And according to the laws of information theory, that can't happen. Information always comes from a mind. It can't be produced by mutations. And we've never seen that happen. Again, mutations might help you survive under certain circumstances, but they don't add brand new information because information never comes about by chance. And by the way, there are different types of mutations. There's a mutation that causes a section of DNA to get duplicated. But do you have any more information? If a paragraph in a newspaper article got duplicated, do you have any more information? Could you learn anything from the second paragraph you couldn't learn from the original? Of course not. It'd be longer, but there's no new information. And that's a law of information theory. And by the way, in their heart of hearts, evolutionists know that information always originates in a mind. They know it can't come about by chance. I know this because I did a little social experiment a number of years ago. I posted an article on my website called On the Origin of Articles, which is a play on Darwin's book. And you can read this on our website, Biblical Science Institute. And the article, it's a satire. It's supposed to convince you that articles do not have authors, but they are generated. They're a sequence of typos, basically, most of which make the article worse, but those ones are thrown away. Occasionally, a typo makes an article better, and those are preserved and carried on, and articles get longer as they evolve over millions of years. Yeah, pretty silly. The article itself was fun, but what was really funny was the responses I got to it. Because I had critics chime in, we know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle. And I said, oh, really? Did you see me write it? Oh, you're taking it on faith. Oh, that's interesting. Oh. But we could trace the IP address and see that you posted it. Hey, I admit to posting it. When this thing evolved on my computer, it was too good not to share it, right? But and I'd start arguing with, I was playing the part of an evolutionist then. I was defending the evolution of this article against these crazy authorists that believe that articles have authors. Isn't that silly, right? I'm like, if you want to believe that, man, that's fine, but keep it in church. Don't. It was really interesting. Now, any one of them could easily have refuted me. They could have proved, they said, we know that you or someone wrote this article because it has information in it. And that would have shut me up. Not one of them took that avenue. You know why? Because then they'd have to admit evolution's false. Isn't that interesting? Because we have information in our DNA that they claim does come about by chance. They would rather be reduced to foolishness than admit they have a creator. The Bible says something about that, doesn't it? That's Romans 1. That's Romans 1. By denying the Bible, they confirmed it. The whole SETI program, listening for alien signals from space, they haven't found any. I don't think they will. New Spielberg movie coming out this year, Disclosure Day or something like that, where we get, make contact with aliens. How would you distinguish an intelligent signal from space from all these natural radio sources? And the answer is, an intelligence transmission would have information in it. The whole SETI program is predicated on that presupposition. And yet DNA has information, and they'll say, oh, that just came about by chance. Inconsistent, hypocritical even. Well, let's talk about geology now in the remaining time. So I first want to talk about these rock layers because up until really the 1600s and 1700s, scientists recognized these sedimentary layers that are laid down by water. These are flood layers, most of them. A few of them post-flood, but most of these are flood layers. That's why we find fossils in them. That's why we find marine fossils on the highest mountaintops. Mount Everest has marine fossils on the top of it. Why? Because this world was once underwater. It was completely covered with water. But secularists believe, no, these were deposited gradually over millions of years. And one of the ways they argue that this happened slowly is a technique called radiometric dating. I want to talk about that just for a few minutes because a lot of people have been intimidated by that and they think that proves that the Earth is very, very old. It's not. So let me show you how it works. This is how radiometric dating works. There are certain atoms. We're all made of atoms, right? These little particles that have protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and then they're surrounded by electrons, negatively charged electrons. Some atoms are very, very big, the heavier ones, and some of those are unstable or radioactive. And what that means is they will spontaneously change into another type of atom, and they'll emit energy as they do that. Like uranium-238. Uranium-238 is unstable or radioactive because it'll emit energy, and you can detect that as like a radio pulse, so they're radioactive. Uranium-238 will decay into thorium-234. It emits a helium nucleus and changes to thorium, and then thorium emits a beta particle and changes to the next element, which changes they're all radioactive until you get to lead-206, and then lead-206 is stable. Once you reach lead-206, it'll stay lead-206 forever. And fortunately, most atoms are stable, so you're not going to change into anything else in the next 24 hours, okay? But a small fraction of these atoms are unstable. They're radioactive, and they change into other atoms. And they do this at a very specific rate. They do it atom by atom, and for a given atom, you don't know when it's going to change. It seems to be random. But when you have a large sample of atoms, you know that statistically, after a certain amount of time, a certain percentage have changed. It's kind of like when you microwave popcorn. You don't know which kernel's going to pop next, do you? But you do know that after about a minute and a half, they've all popped, right? If they're going to pop, they've popped. It's the same way with uranium changing into lead. Based on the rate at which it changes, theoretically, it would take something like 4 or 5 billion years for half of uranium to decay into lead, and eventually it would be all lead. So here's the story. You have a chunk of uranium. Based on the rate it's decaying, we know that eventually you'd have some uranium, some lead, and then if you waited long enough, eventually it would be all lead. And we know the rate at which this happens. And so the idea is if you find a rock that has some uranium and some lead in it, you could extrapolate back and figure out, you might think when it was all uranium, but how do you know it was all uranium to start with? If you find a rock with some uranium and some lead in it, how do you know I didn't make the rock yesterday with some uranium and some lead in it? You see what I'm saying? Some people, you might think secularists would assume that the rock started out as pure uranium. They don't assume that. They assume it had some lead in it to begin with. Well, how much lead should you begin with? If you tell me how old you want the rock to be, I'll tell you how much lead it started with. You see, there's an issue there. And my secular colleagues are aware of this, and there are what are called isochron methods, where they try to make a guess about the initial ratio, but you don't really know. So that's one of the assumptions that's involved in radiometric dating. What we have is a rock that has some uranium, some lead, and some of the intermediate elements as well. That's what we have, and we can measure the amount of those elements. Then you make certain assumptions about the past, and you estimate the age. And your age estimate will be only as good as your assumptions. And that does help you tell time if your assumptions are right. It's kind of like if you had an hourglass. Suppose when you first came into this room, I had an hourglass and it looked like that. It's about halfway done. And I say, how long ago did I turn that over? And you say, well, it's an hourglass. It's halfway through. I'd say about a half an hour. I say, I gotcha. I turned it over 1 minute before you came in the room, but already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. You assumed that all the sand was in the top chamber to begin with. You didn't know that, right? That's one of the assumptions that is made. How do you know somebody didn't add sand when you weren't looking? Right? I mean, uranium is leachable in salt water. It can move in and out of rocks under certain circumstances. How do you know that hasn't happened over the ages? How do you know the throat of the bottle's always been the same size? That's probably a pretty realistic guess for glass. That tends not to change that much. But the point is, we don't know why radioactive decay happens at the rate that it does, which means we don't know that it's always happened at the same rate. It might have been faster in the past. And there was a research team that discovered very compelling evidence that radioactive decay rates were much faster in the past. The Rate Research Group did some wonderful research on that topic. So these are some of the assumptions involved in radiometric dating. One, that the initial conditions are known. You know the initial amount of parent to daughter product. That the decay rate is constant, which we now know is false under certain circumstances, and that the system is closed, that material hasn't moved in and out of the rock, okay? Compelling evidence that number 2 is wrong. We know that we can change certain types of radioactive decay in a laboratory. The rhenium-osmium reaction, for example, scientists have been able to speed it up by a factor of 1 billion. They can make it decay 1 billion times faster by stripping away the electrons. This is true. It's called bound state beta decay. And the point is, if we can do it, obviously God can do it. So there may have been 1 or more points in the past where the decay rates were much faster. But the bottom line is we know that radiometric dating is not a reliable way to tell the age of a rock. And we know that because we've tested it on rocks whose age is known. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, and then there were some subsequent eruptions, as I'm sure you know, we took some of the brand new rocks that were created in that eruption, and when they harden from the magma, that's supposed to set the 0 point of the clock. Because when it's magma, the minerals can move in and out. But when it hardens, it's supposed to trap the minerals in there, and even gas like argon. And so we went in, we took some of these brand new rocks and sent them into secular labs so we couldn't be accused of bias, and said, please give us the age estimates for these rocks using radiometric dating. And they came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on rocks that we know are brand new. And this is not an isolated incident. We've done it with rocks from Hawaii. If you take a brand new rock from, you can stick a pole in the magma, pull it out, watch it harden, send it into a lab. You'll get millions of years. That's how old they'll tell you that. That's how long ago that rock formed. Interesting. Radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age. Secularists assume that it works on rocks of unknown age. That's the bottom line. I don't think that's very logical. Do you? Okay. What about carbon dating? If you were here this morning, I talked briefly about that. Carbon dating is a similar process, except it works with carbon atoms, and only a certain kind of carbon atoms. Most carbon is C12, but there's a special variety called C14 that has 2 extra neutrons. And C14 is produced in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays from outer space bombard nitrogen atoms, convert them into C14. C14 is radioactive, and it will decay back to nitrogen with a half-life of 5,730 years. That's how long it takes for half of C14 to decay into nitrogen, and then half again every 5,700 years. And the bottom line is, after 1 million years, you wouldn't have even 1 atom of it left. Okay, it decays quickly. Now, when animals are alive, they're breathing, and they're eating food. Plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and 1 atom in a trillion is C14. And so, plants they extract the carbon, they release the oxygen into the air, and we breathe that, and that's very helpful. The plants use the carbon to build up their structure. Animals eat the plants and use the carbon to build up their structure. We eat the animals or we eat the plants. Either way, we get carbon into our bodies. And so a small fraction of the carbon in your body is C14. 1 atom in a trillion is C14. So you're all slightly unstable. How about that? You knew that, right? Now, that C14 is constantly decaying back to nitrogen, atom by atom, but you're replacing it because you eat food and you get new C14 in your body. And so when you're alive, the C14 to C12 ratio in you is about the same as it is in the environment until you die. And when you die, you're not replacing the carbon anymore. It just decays away. And so at the moment of death, the C14 to C12 ratio in you is about the same as it is in the environment. But then after death, it just decays away. And so if you find the remains of a plant or animal or human being and measure the C14 to C12 ratio, theoretically you can tell how long ago it died. And that's pretty neat because the answers that we get are always roughly consistent with the biblical timescale. We've carbon dated dinosaur remains. You don't get millions of years, you get a few thousand years. Everyone we've tested has C14 in it. Coal beds. Evolutionists teach that coal beds are hundreds of millions of years old, in which case there shouldn't be 1 atom of C14. But every chunk of coal we've tested has C14 in it, which limits the age to a few thousand years. Diamonds. We've taken diamonds, and you have to destroy them to do this accurately, which is kind of a shame. But we've destroyed them, and then from the remains, we've detected C14 in them, which means they're nowhere near billions of years old. They can't even be 1 million years old, or the carbon-14 would be gone. And secularists say, well, somehow new C14 got in there. It's contaminated. It's a diamond. It's the hardest substance. How are you going to get new C14 in there? They must have formed with the C14 in there, and that was only thousands of years ago, not millions or billions. There are a lot of things like that set the age of the world to much less than what the secularists would like. The rate at which salt flows into the ocean, even fresh water has a little bit of salt in it, and it picks up from the land, dumps it into the ocean. The water evaporates, leaves the salt, which means oceans are getting saltier every year by 450 million tons. We can measure that rate. You can get rid of a little bit of it with salt sprays and things like that, but for the most part, the oceans are just getting saltier and saltier every year. You do the math, how long would it take, even being generous to the critics, how long would it take Going back in time to where the oceans had zero salt, 62 million years. 62 million years. You say, well, that's a long time. But that's an upper limit because you can't have less salt than no salt, right? So that's the maximum possible age. And yet the secularists believe the oceans are 3 billion years old. Problem, because they can't be older than 62 million years. That's consistent with the biblical age of 6,000 years because we believe the oceans started salty already. They've only gotten a little bit saltier since creation. But the point is they can't be 3 billion years old because the salt, you'd be able to walk across them by now. They'd be all salt at this point. Okay? Likewise, the rate at which mud accumulates on the ocean floor, 20 billion tons a year. You can get rid of maybe 1 billion tons with plate tectonics, but the other 19 billion tons simply accumulate. How long till you get the current amount of mud on the ocean floor? Starting from zero, less than 12 million years. And that's assuming there was no worldwide flood, which would dump a lot of mud on the ocean floor quickly. So that's, again, an upper limit. That's much less than the 3 billion years that the secularists claim, but it's perfectly consistent with the biblical age of 6,000 years. How long does it take to get Earth's current population of human beings from just 2? Oh, it doesn't take anywhere near millions of years. It's very consistent with the biblical time scale. And we have population estimates, and of course today, these days, we have surveys, we have a census that's conducted every now and then. And so we know the rate of population increase. You have to account for, greater mortality rates in the past and so on, but it's very consistent with the biblical time scale. A lot of stuff like that. But the best evidence that the world's thousands of years old, we have the birth certificate of the universe, signed by God himself, written in stone by God's own finger, by the way. Most of the Bible, God used human agents to write exactly what he wanted them to write. There's one section where he didn't even use a human. He wrote it with his own finger in stone, and that's the place where it says, in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them. So secularists say the earth's billions of years old, take my word for it. God says, I created in 6 days, take my word for it. That's the bottom line. Now, the evidence is consistent with the biblical time scale, but that's the bottom line. What about fossils? But don't fossils take millions of years to form? Actually, fossils tend to form under catastrophic conditions, especially flood conditions. This is a fossil ichthyosaur. It's a marine reptile now thought to be extinct, buried in rock layers that were laid down by water. That's interesting. It's a swimming creature, but it drowned. I mean, it's air-breathing. And it was killed and fossilized in the process of giving birth. Do you see the baby ichthyosaur being born there? They're born tail first because they're air breathers. That's neat. So as soon as they're born, they have to swim to the surface and get their first breath of air. That's why they're born tail first, you see. Now, how did evolution figure that out? How many millions of years do you think it took to turn that thing around? Because other organisms are born head first, right? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that what a neat design feature? God is so clever. Here's a fish fossilized in the process of eating another fish. Rapidly, folks. Rapid, catastrophic burial. That's how you form a fossil. Most things don't fossilize. People have the impression that, animals die and then over millions of years they turn into a fossil. But we know better. If you come across a dead animal on the side of the road, it doesn't slowly turn into a fossil. It decays, right? Here's your dead cat, right? And we're going to do a little experiment to watch him slowly fossilize. You come back a few days later, is he starting to fossilize? No, he's starting to smell bad. He's starting to decay. And after a few more days, he smells really bad. And after a few more days, parts of him are missing. After a few more days, more of him is missing, and eventually he's pretty well missing, right? Animals don't slowly turn into statues. Most of them are recycled back into the environment, and that's a very good thing. In order to fossilize something, you have to bury it to protect it from the environment. And even then, I was given the wrong impression because I went through the public school system, and I was taught the fish dies, it sinks down to the bottom, and over millions of years, it's covered up with sediment. That makes no sense, because if this layer happened a million years after that layer, the top part of the fish would have had plenty of time to decay back into the environment. It had to be buried rapidly. And most fish float anyway when they die, right? If you do want to form a fossil fish, here's how you do it. You go home to your aquarium. And you pour some concrete in there, okay? There you go. This is probably illegal in Oregon. All right. It's going to kill that poor fish, right? And bury him. And usually there's enough microbes left in there that they can eat away at the soft part of the fish, but the bones mineralize. The minerals will come in and fill all the holes in the bone. Bones are porous. They're very light because they have a lot of holes. Minerals will fill in the holes and turn that stone into bone. That's what a fossil is. And you come back later, you'll have a fossil fish. That's how you do it. We know we can do this. We can do this in a laboratory in a matter of days. It doesn't take millions of years. It just takes the right conditions. What about the types of fossils that we find? Are they consistent with evolution? I was taught, see, here's the evolution of the horse. Wow, that's compelling. But wait a minute, those are just different varieties of horse. You say, oh, but they're different sizes. Yeah, they're different. The feet are a little different. The modern horse has a single toe. There were ancient varieties that had 3, right? And besides, they're different sizes. That's okay. These are both adult horses. They're just different breeds. That's not a problem. Now, we don't have any more of the 3-toed variety, but there are plenty of other varieties of horse. What we don't find in the fossil record is a non-horse becoming a horse. What we find in the fossil record overwhelmingly is change within kinds. You won't find changes between the major kinds. You won't find it. They don't exist, except in the imaginations of evolutionists. What about the rocks in which these fossils are found? Don't rocks take millions of years to form? Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that took millions of years to form. Here's a man-made clock embedded inside solid rock. Isn't that interesting? That's the one rock we know right when it happened, right? Because it's got a built-in clock. Yeah, okay. What about these rock layers? There's a person down there for scale. Not all of them are lithified, but some of them are. Some of these are rock layers. These didn't exist before 1980. Those didn't take millions of years. Those were produced in the Mount St. Helens eruptions. Yeah. It laid down many layers of new sediment, some of which have lithified into rock. One volcano did that. One. And it's a rather small volcano by volcano standards. During the flood, the Bible says the mountains or the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That might refer to underwater volcanoes, perhaps all of them going off at the same time. The flood was not a gentle event. You know, there's the song, you know, the rains came down and the floods came up. It was a catastrophe. The Bible uses a special word for it, Mabul. That's, if you ever read in the King James, a flood of waters, and it's like, well, what else is a flood going to be made of? Well, it's because the word for flood is actually a cataclysm of waters. Well, Mount St. Helens cut out a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon in a matter of hours. It doesn't take millions of years for canyons to form. It takes catastrophic conditions. So I won't go through all these for time's sake. But the point is, the evidence that we see is very consistent with the biblical time scale and a worldwide flood. It's not consistent with the idea of millions of years. What we see is evidence of catastrophe. And when you see all these fossils, and you know, maybe a section of the road where they've cut through it and you see the fossils on this, it's amazing. That's a reminder that this world was flooded by God because God is righteous and he will not tolerate sin forever. He's very merciful, but eventually he will judge sin. And the flood is one example of that. That's why God sent the flood. It was because the wickedness of mankind was so great. The real message of the rock layers, repent. That's what they mean. Yeah. It's a reminder, because God's going to judge the world again next time by fire. Are you ready? And of course, the only way we escape the next judgment, the final judgment, is by faith in Christ. I think it's interesting that God is gracious and he provided Noah a way to go through that flood, to help him out of that, so that he didn't perish in that catastrophe. But then God was the one that closed the door on the ark. That's significant. God was the one that decided time of mercy is over, time of judgment begins. And we never know when that's going to be. That's why today is the day of salvation. If you haven't already, today's the day to put your faith in Christ, to trust that God rose him from the dead and that he has paid for your sins on the cross. Profess him as Lord so that you can escape the coming judgment and be made right with God. Well, again, we have some resources on the back table there. What I spoke about this morning, the importance of Genesis, why this issue really matters, covered in that book. And easy read, but it's very, very powerful resource. Understanding Genesis, refuting the idea that the days could actually be vast ages. No, they can, and the text is very clear about that. And so that goes through those issues. The ultimate proof of creation, showing you how creation is necessarily true. I haven't done that this evening. I've shown you how the evidence is consistent with creation, but I haven't proved it. If you want an absolute bulletproof argument for creation, that's it. And it's very different from the kind of argument people think they should use, but it's very powerful. And I've been able to teach this method to teenagers in a week, and they get it. And they can defend the faith against any opposition. We have that on DVD as well. Taking Back Astronomy, showing how the universe declares God's glory, not billions of years or a big bang or anything like that. Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, how to better enjoy the night sky from a Christian perspective. That's just a fun resource. And we have DVDs along that topic as well, such as Astronomy Reveals Creation or Worlds of Creation that takes you on a tour of the solar system. Those are fun resources. Keeping Faith in an Age of Reason, answering over 400 alleged Bible contradictions. Introduction to Logic, how to use your mind rightly and to the glory of God. What a great resource that is. And then again, you can get the best of our books together for a discount. That's our book pack. That's tonight only. Or our video pack for a 20% discount, or our library pack for a 30% discount. We're out of some of the resources, but if you go ahead and purchase that tonight, we'll ship them to you for free. Okay, we're only doing back orders for the packs because you can't get the packs on the website. Everything else you can. We do have children's resources as well, such as the Answers for Teens or Answers for Kids. These are wonderful resources. The kids will love them. They're very colorful, and they're really for adults disguised as kids' books. You read them with them, and you'll learn stuff too. You will, but it gives them theologically and scientifically accurate answers to questions like, what about Pangea? What about continental drift? Was there an ice age? Where did Cain get his wife? Things like that. And then also One Blood for Kids, showing the biblical answer to racism by pointing out there's only one race, the human race. And it goes through some of the genetic stuff we talked about this evening as well. Don't forget to sign up for our free monthly newsletter and check us out on the web, biblicalscienceinstitute.com. And we're going to take a 15-minute book buying break. So please go ahead and check out those resources. We may start packing those up during the Q&A, so I would appreciate it if you get those now. And then in 15 minutes, if you want to, come back and we'll have a Q&A session. Okay? Thank you very much. God bless.